Chapter 1. The question that shattered my world. When Kayla and I first met, I thought I'd found everything a man could want in a woman. She was funny, adventurous, a little mysterious, and she filled every day with laughter. We built our life together, brick by brick, finding joy in the small, simple things. Friday movie nights, lazy Sundays, impromptu weekend getaways. To everyone around us, we seemed like the perfect couple, and for years, I believed it too. But then one night, while we were having dinner, she put down her fork, looked me in the eye, and said, "Jack, there's something I need to tell you." At first, I thought it was something small. Maybe she wanted to try a new job, or maybe she was planning a surprise. But what came next changed everything. She told me she wanted to explore new relationships. "It's temporary," she said, "just for a few months." She spoke so calmly, as though this was a reasonable request, as though it wouldn't tear apart the very foundation of our life together. How do you react when someone you love tells you they want to be with other people, just to see what's out there? That's when I realized nothing about this was simple. Nothing about her words made sense. Yet there she was, confident, sure of herself, as if she'd planned this conversation for weeks. And maybe she had. Maybe she'd rehearsed every word, believing I would just accept it. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know whether to get angry, beg her to reconsider, or try to understand. But beneath my calm facade, something broke. At that moment, I knew that whatever was coming next, I wouldn't be the one to bend. I wondered then if there had been signs, things I'd ignored. The question hung in the air like a challenge, a weight I could feel pressing down on me, drawing me toward a decision I hadn't expected to make. How could this be happening? And what was I going to do about it? Author's comment: as I reflect on Jack's story, I can feel his pain. How many times have we heard about a marriage that seemed perfect from the outside, only to discover hidden fractures? It's gut-wrenching to realize that Kayla, who should have been his anchor, was the one loosening the ties. What will Jack do now? Will he confront her head-on? Or will he find another way to reclaim his life? The stage is set for what promises to be an emotional journey, and I can't help but feel both anxious and hopeful for Jack. Chapter 2. The calm before the storm. The days following that dinner felt surreal. I went through my usual routines, went to work, came home, tried to make small talk. I was desperately searching for a trace of the woman I had once known. But each time I looked at her, it was like staring at a stranger who was hiding a part of herself I'd never known existed. Kayla didn't bring up the conversation again, perhaps thinking I'd come to terms with it, or maybe hoping I'd just let it go. But I knew I couldn't. There was a chasm between us now, a crack that only grew wider with every day. So I did what I knew best. I went silent. I watched, I listened, and I started gathering pieces of the truth. I was determined not to be blindsided again. I took the time to set things up. Cameras, recorders, anything that would help me gather proof of whatever it was she was planning. I didn't want to believe she'd betray me, but I couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at my gut. It was almost as if I needed to confirm the worst, so I could finally let go of the last threads of love I was holding onto. Every day, I waited for her to say something, to tell me it was all a misunderstanding, but she didn't. And as the days turned into weeks, I felt myself slipping further away from her, from the man I used to be, from the life I thought was real. In that silence, in that waiting, a new resolve took root. Author's comment: there's a saying that silence can be more powerful than words, and in Jack's case, it's a shield, a means of self-preservation. He's building a fortress around his heart, one brick at a time, while he waits for the inevitable truth. It's heartbreaking yet fascinating to see how a man transforms when his trust is shattered. Will he find the strength to confront her, or will he let his silence do the talking? Chapter 3. Unraveling the lies. The truth came slowly, pieced together from Kayla's texts, her secret conversations, the nights she claimed to be with friends. Each discovery was like a punch to the gut, but by then, I'd learned how to keep my emotions under control. I saw names I didn't recognize, places she'd been, and details that left little room for doubt. Every time I gathered another piece of her deceit, it felt like I was removing a brick from the foundation of our marriage. The worst part was that she didn't even seem to feel guilty. She was casual, carefree, as if this double life didn't cost her a thing. And maybe, for her, it didn't. She had always been strong-willed, independent, but I'd thought that strength was part of what bound us together. Now, I was starting to see it as the wall that divided us. With each new piece of evidence, I felt my patience wearing thin. How long could I pretend to go along with this? How long could I stand the sight of her, knowing she'd been with others? There was a voice in my head urging me to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew better. If I wanted justice, if I wanted closure, I needed to wait just a little longer. Author's comment: Jack's journey is painful to witness. The patience he's showing, the quiet restraint. It's incredible, really. He's holding onto his dignity with a grip that must be exhausting, but I think we can all understand why. If he were to confront her too soon, she might talk her way out of it. She might manipulate him again, twist the narrative. Jack's patience, though excruciating, is his strength right now. I'm rooting for him to see this through. Chapter 4. The turning point. I'll never forget the night I finally made my move. I'd spent months carefully collecting evidence, each piece feeling like a dagger I'd have to thrust eventually. Photos, text messages, voice recordings, every lie and betrayal captured in damning clarity. I'd even managed to talk to a few of her friends who, once they knew the truth, admitted they couldn't stand by her either. They'd agreed to testify if it came to that. When I came home that night, I felt a strange calm. I was no longer the man grappling with disbelief or anger. I was a man with a purpose, finally ready to lay this chapter to rest. I sat down at the kitchen table, spread out the stack of evidence, and waited. Outside, the evening crept into darkness, and every sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, felt sharp and clear, like the air before a storm. The door opened, and in she walked, dropping her keys on the table without even looking up. She muttered a casual "hey," the same greeting she'd given 1,000 times. I didn't respond. I watched as she walked past, but then she paused, sensing something was off. When she finally looked at me, her eyes fell on the stack of papers, the thumb drive, the printed texts, the undeniable proof of everything she'd done. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a crack in her confidence. Her face paled as realization hit, her mask slipping as she took in the damning evidence of her betrayal. She tried to recover, to summon that usual calm, but the weight of it was too much. She stammered, her eyes flickering from the papers to me, as if looking for some sign that it wasn't as bad as it looked. "Jack, I don't even know what to say," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. I could see the wheels turning as she scrambled for an explanation, a justification, anything that might soften the blow. But I'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. I cut her off before she could launch into excuses. "How long did you think you'd get away with it?" I asked, my voice steady, almost detached. "Did you really believe I wouldn't find out?" She flinched at the harshness of my tone, but she recovered quickly, trying to appeal to the man she thought she knew. "Jack, it was a mistake. A series of mistakes. I was lost. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I still love you. Stop." I held up a hand, feeling the anger I'd kept buried for so long starting to surface. "You don't get to stand there and say you love me, not after everything I've uncovered. You had your chance to explain. You chose not to." She fell silent, her defenses crumbling as I continued. I told her how deeply her betrayal had cut, how I'd spent sleepless nights wondering where I'd gone wrong, only to realize that this wasn't about me at all. It was about her selfishness, her need for something new, no matter the cost. I laid it all out, every piece of pain she'd caused, every moment of doubt she'd forced me to live through. And as I spoke, I saw her shrink back, realizing the full impact of what she'd done. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice steady but full of pain. "I trusted you. I built a life with you. And you threw it away like it was nothing. You thought you'd just slip back in when you were done, that I'd still be here, ready to forgive. But you were wrong." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, her calm, controlled exterior shattered completely, leaving her bare, exposed, and vulnerable. She looked down at the evidence, then back at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and panic. You're really ending this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes," I replied, and for the first time, I felt peace. It wasn't the evidence that mattered, not anymore. What mattered was the clarity, the finality. I had nothing left to give, and in that moment, I felt free. The weight of the months of anger and betrayal lifted, leaving me with a calm I hadn't felt in what seemed like years. She crumbled then, her shoulders shaking as the tears came. But I felt nothing, not pity, not sympathy. I'd spent months mourning our marriage, the life we'd once dreamed of, but I was done grieving. I stood up, gathering the evidence into a neat stack. "Pack your things," I said, my voice steady. "I want you out by tomorrow." She looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading, but I was resolute. There was no going back. I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the cold, hard evidence of her choices. That night, as I lay alone in the bed we'd once shared, I felt a strange calm. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't love her. I was finally, truly free. Author's comment: Jack's strength here is remarkable. After everything he's been through, he's finally getting the closure he deserves. It's cathartic to see him confront her, to see the power shift in his favor. This was his moment to regain control, to take back his life, and he did it with dignity and resolve. Chapter 5. Watching her fall, Kayla sat across from me, her face ashen, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and desperation. I could see the wheels in her mind turning, scrambling for any way to claw back control, to undo what she'd so recklessly destroyed. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the pile of evidence I'd laid before her. Texts, receipts, photos, proof that left no room for denial. She looked up at me, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came. For the first time, Kayla was speechless, and I could see her usual confidence slipping away. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Jack, it wasn't what you think." Her voice was weak, almost childlike, a tone I hadn't heard from her in years. "It was just a phase." I was confused. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought. She paused, swallowing hard as she tried to read my expression. "I thought I'd come back to you. I always intended to." Her words felt like empty echoes, attempts to fill the silence with something that might soften the truth. "I always intended to come back to you," as if I were some loyal, waiting placeholder, an anchor she could cast aside whenever she wanted freedom, knowing I'd be there when she chose to return. Each sentence she uttered felt like an insult, a reminder of just how little she thought of me and of what we had built together. For a moment, I watched her in silence, letting her words fade into the heavy air between us. She pressed on, stammering out weak apologies, pleading for understanding. "I made a mistake, Jack. It was a terrible mistake, but I love you. You're the only one I love. This was just a way for me to find myself. I didn't think it would hurt you like this." She trailed off, her voice breaking as she saw that her words were landing on deaf ears. Her mask was slipping away, the self-assured, bold Kayla giving way to someone more fragile, more desperate. She had always believed she could talk her way out of anything, charm her way back into good graces. But this time, her words were hollow, falling apart before they even left her lips. I stayed silent, watching her as she unraveled, seeing her for the first time as a woman who was finally facing the consequences of her choices. The confidence, the calm superiority, the sense of control she'd wielded for so long. It was all gone. All I saw was someone who had built her world on selfish choices, and who now found that world collapsing around her. She looked up at me again, her eyes filled with pleading. "Please, Jack," she whispered. "We can get through this. I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to be the end." I felt a strange calm settle over me, a kind of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. This was no longer about anger or heartbreak. I had gone beyond that. I was past hoping for explanations, for apologies that might make this easier to bear. Kayla's betrayal had carved a hole in me so deep that there was no room for her words anymore. "I trusted you, Kayla," I finally said, my voice steady, cold. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let my emotions show. I wanted her to hear each word, to feel them the way I had felt the hurt she had caused. "I gave you everything. I believed in you, in us. And you threw it all away like it was nothing. You wanted to explore? Fine. But now, you have to live with that. You don't get to come back and pretend nothing happened." She looked down, shoulders slumping, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence that followed was as heavy as the betrayal between us. There was no more scrambling for words, no more protests. For the first time, I saw true defeat in her. She knew she had lost me, lost the life we'd built, lost the future we'd planned. The realization settled over her like a shadow, weighing her down as she stared at the floor. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected: satisfaction. I hadn't planned to feel this way, hadn't anticipated that seeing her truly understand the depth of her betrayal would bring me a sense of peace. But it did. I knew, then, that she was finally tasting the bitterness of what she had done, that she was feeling even a fraction of the hurt she'd inflicted on me. And that brought a strange sense of justice. I stood, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. She looked up, her face streaked with silent tears, a last glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes, as if she thought I might still change my mind. But I knew that wasn't possible. I had come to the end of this road, and there was no going back. "Goodbye, Kayla," I said quietly, turning toward the door. The words felt final, like a weight lifted from my shoulders. I didn't look back as I left the room, leaving her alone with the wreckage she had created. As I walked away, a calm washed over me. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. Author's comment: this is the turning point where Jack's inner strength shines through. Watching Kayla's remorse, he could have easily caved, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed firm, knowing that forgiveness wasn't enough to heal this wound. This moment feels like justice, a kind of emotional retribution for all the pain she caused him. I can't help but feel proud of Jack for standing his ground. He deserves better. Chapter 6. The divorce papers. The next morning, I walked into the attorney's office as soon as it opened. I didn't want a dramatic divorce. I wanted it clean, quick, and airtight. I handed over everything: the photos, texts, recordings, evidence enough to make my case bulletproof. My attorney nodded as he reviewed it, and I could see the quiet, grim approval in his eyes. It was all I needed to know that I was doing the right thing. As I left the office, there was a strange calm in me. I thought I might feel rage, maybe sadness, but all I felt was relief. I'd spent months drowning in doubt and suspicion, holding on to the remnants of what I'd thought our marriage was. But filing those papers felt like closing a chapter. Now, I could finally let go. That evening, Kayla called me, her voice a mix of anger and panic. "Jack, I got the papers today," she said, struggling to keep the tremor out of her voice. I don't understand. You didn't even give me a chance to make things right." I almost laughed at the irony. She'd had every chance to make things right, but she'd made her choice, over and over again. I stayed silent, letting her fill the silence with her excuses, her pleas. "I know I messed up," she continued, her voice softening, trying to coax some sympathy out of me. "But we can work through this, Jack. We've been together so long. I'll change, I promise." I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I responded. "Kayla," I said, keeping my voice as calm and firm as I could. "We're done. This is the end of us. Accept it." For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I could almost hear her processing the finality of it, trying to wrap her head around the fact that she couldn't talk her way out of this one. The disbelief was thick in her voice when she finally spoke. "You don't mean that. You're just angry." "No, Kayla. I'm done," I replied, resolute. I could hear the fear in her silence, the realization that this wasn't something she could brush off, that she'd finally pushed me too far. She had always believed I'd stay, no matter what. I suppose, in her mind, I'd always been there, the stable one who'd forgive anything. But I knew that version of me was gone. She'd erased him with every lie, every careless moment she'd spent with someone else. "Please, Jack, just give me one more chance. I'll prove it to you," she pleaded, desperation now coloring every word. But I wasn't swayed. I'd been through every emotion in the book over the past months, and by now, I was numb to her words. I'd loved her once, trusted her completely, but whatever was left had turned to stone. "Kayla, you made your choice," I said, "and now I'm making mine." I could feel her disbelief shift to panic, her tone turning sharp, almost accusing. She started to say something, maybe a threat, maybe a plea, but I hung up. I wasn't going to let her drag this out, turn it into something toxic. I'd learned enough from the past few months to know that I couldn't afford to let her pull me back in. That was the last time we spoke as husband and wife. There was a finality to it, like the closing of a book. In her silence, I could almost hear the realization settle in, that I was serious, that I was really walking away. It was as though she couldn't comprehend that I'd actually reached my breaking point. I suppose, in her mind, she'd always believed she'd get away with it, that I'd forgive her and we'd move on. But she'd finally pushed me too far, and I wasn't looking back. In the weeks that followed, I felt a strange emptiness where our life had once been. Little reminders of her lingered everywhere. Photos we'd taken together, the small things she'd left behind. But instead of filling me with pain, they filled me with resolve. Each memory reminded me of the lies, of the betrayal, and every reminder made me feel lighter. This was a new beginning, one I hadn't chosen, but one I was determined to make my own. Friends and family were shocked when they heard about the divorce. I could see the questions in their eyes, the disbelief. I knew they didn't understand, and maybe I didn't need them to. I'd gone through the fire and come out the other side, and that was enough for me. In the end, the divorce went as smoothly as I'd hoped. There were no last-minute pleas from her, no attempts to drag it out in court. Once she realized how serious I was, she signed the papers. It was as though, After all her bravado and her attempts at deflection, she knew she was truly defeated. And when that final document was signed, I felt an unexpected surge of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized was there. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The future stretched out before me, uncertain but free of the betrayal that had poisoned my life for so long. I was no longer Jack, Kayla's husband. I was just Jack, and that was enough. Author's comment: Jack's decision to file for divorce is brave and powerful. He's reclaiming his life, cutting the ties that once bound him to someone who betrayed him so deeply. This chapter marks the end of one life and the beginning of another for Jack. It's a bittersweet moment, but one filled with hope for what's to come. Chapter 7. Picking up the pieces. The days after our divorce felt strange and unsteady, a mix of quiet loneliness and unexpected relief. I'd wake up each morning to an empty house, the silence pressing down on me in a way that used to feel comforting, but now felt hollow. I'd gotten used to living in a quiet house, but this was different. This quiet was real. No silent resentment simmering under the surface, no suspicion hanging between us like an invisible wall. Just an empty, simple quiet. There was freedom in that silence, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to hold my breath or wonder where Kayla was or who she was with. That chapter was closed. I could move through the house without feeling like a stranger in my own life. I didn't have to wait for the other shoe to drop or wonder if I'd find more pieces of her hidden life. The place was finally mine, but that realization came with a strange, empty ache too. I turned my focus to the things I'd let slip over the years, the hobbies I'd left behind, the friendships that had fallen away. I started going to the gym again, picking up woodworking projects I'd abandoned, even dusting off my old guitar. I'd forgotten what it felt like to lose myself in a project, to feel a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to anyone else. Little by little, life started filling in the empty spaces Kayla had left behind. One evening, I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months, maybe even a year. We met for a drink, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt a genuine laugh escape. It startled me, the sound of it. I'd been so used to forced smiles and polite laughs, hiding how broken I'd felt on the inside, that I'd forgotten what real laughter sounded like. It felt good, grounding, like a small step back toward myself. But the memories lingered too, especially in the quiet moments. I'd be in the middle of a project or watching a movie alone, and suddenly, a memory of us would drift in, uninvited and unfiltered. I'd wonder if I'd missed something, some sign early on that could have saved me from all of this. I'd think back to the small moments, her laughter, the way she'd reach for my hand in crowded places. For a long time, I couldn't help but search those memories, looking for the moment she'd begun slipping away. There were times when I'd even question myself, wondering if I could have done something to change the course we'd taken. Could I have been more attentive? Did I miss a chance to fix things before it was too late? The doubts crept in like shadows, but each time, I forced myself to remember that this wasn't a single misstep. This was a choice she'd made again and again. I'd given everything I had to that marriage, and in the end, she'd chosen to betray that. Slowly, those memories held less and less power over me. They still surfaced, still pulled at old wounds. But each day they faded just a little. I found myself thinking of her less, remembering her less. She'd become like a distant figure in a story I'd once read, familiar but disconnected from the life I was building now. I realized I was growing stronger, even if some days it didn't feel like it. The loneliness wasn't something I could shake overnight, and there were still moments when I felt it like a weight pressing on my chest. But in those moments, I'd remind myself that I was no longer living a lie, that this was a loneliness I could bear because it was honest, it was real. I was rebuilding my life on my terms, without the pain of betrayal lurking in the background. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. And in that emptiness, I was finding myself again. I was reclaiming pieces of the man I'd lost somewhere along the way. A man who didn't have to second-guess every moment, who could feel at peace in his own skin. I was learning to be alone without feeling abandoned, to appreciate my own company in a way I hadn't before. With each passing day, the emptiness of the house became less oppressive, the silence less haunting. Life was coming back to me, one small step at a time. I knew I was far from healed, that the scars of what had happened would remain. But I also knew that I was moving forward, that I wasn't the man Kayla had left broken and betrayed. I was someone else now, someone stronger, someone ready to live a life free from the shadows she cast. It would be a long road. I knew that. But for the first time in a long time, I was hopeful about what lay ahead. And that hope, fragile as it was, felt like the beginning of something real. Author's comment. It's incredible to see Jack rebuild himself from the ground up. He's carrying the scars of betrayal, but he's also learning to live for himself again. Watching him rediscover joy, even in small things, is inspiring. Healing is a slow process, but Jack's resilience shines through in these small steps forward. Chapter 8. Finding strength in solitude. In the weeks after the divorce, I started to embrace the solitude in a way I hadn't before. I'd always thought of myself as someone who thrived with company, a person who needed someone by my side to share my thoughts, my dreams, even the small, everyday things. But now, without Kayla's presence to fill the silences, I found myself alone in a way that was both daunting and oddly peaceful. At first, the quiet was unsettling. I was so used to checking in with someone, to sharing the mundane details of my day, that I'd find myself reaching for my phone instinctively, only to stop halfway through dialing. Those first few weeks were filled with moments where I'd think, Kayla would like this, or I should tell her about that. But gradually, I stopped feeling the urge to reach out, realizing that I didn't need someone else's presence to validate my experiences. It was a shift, slow but steady, as I began to discover a strange kind of comfort in my own company. I started reading again, picking up books I'd bought years ago and never opened. I'd get lost in them for hours, letting the stories fill the silence that had once felt so oppressive. And when I wasn't reading, I found myself drawn to new things, new skills I'd never bothered to try. I picked up cooking, spending quiet evenings experimenting with recipes, enjoying the process without the need to impress anyone. I found a kind of pride in these small accomplishments, a pleasure in doing things purely for myself. Sometimes, on weekends, I'd go for long drives with no destination in mind. I'd take back roads, explore routes I'd never driven before. There was something liberating about it, the sense that I could go anywhere, that there was no one waiting, no plans to stick to. Just me, the open road, and whatever direction I chose. It reminded me that life was still out there, that even after everything, the world still held possibilities. People started asking if I was ready to date again, if I'd started looking for someone new. The idea almost felt foreign, even repellent. I wasn't ready to open up, not when I was still piecing together who I was outside of my marriage. I realized that, for years, I'd defined myself by my role as a husband, as one half of a couple. Now, I was learning who I was on my own terms, and I knew it would take time. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to let things unfold slowly. I felt no rush to fill the space someone else had left. I wanted to feel whole by myself before inviting someone else in. Looking back, I could see that the betrayal, as painful as it had been, had forced me to confront parts of myself I'd ignored. It had stripped me down, peeled away the layers I'd built around myself. I'd had to look in the mirror and face the pieces of myself that were left, and it hadn't been easy. There were nights when the silence felt like it might crush me, when the memories snuck up on me, filling my mind with doubts and regrets. But in facing those moments alone, I was finding a strength within me that I'd never needed before, a resilience I hadn't realized I possessed. That strength grew with each day, little by little, like a muscle I was learning to rely on. I'd always thought strength was something external, something you showed in the face of adversity. But now, I realized it was something quieter, something internal. It was the courage to keep going, to sit with the uncomfortable parts of myself, to face the loneliness and let it be, without trying to mask it with someone else's presence. It was the realization that I could be enough on my own. I wasn't healed, but I was healing. Each day, I felt a little more like myself. Or maybe it was a new self, one that had been there all along, buried beneath years of habits and compromises. Either way, I was starting to trust that this version of me, the one who could stand alone, was the truest version yet. I knew I wasn't the same man who'd stood at the altar, full of hope and certainty, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this new strength, this independence, was a gift hidden in the wreckage of what had once been. For now, that was enough. I was enough. Author's comment. Jack's solitude is becoming his sanctuary, a place where he can truly find himself again. His choice to focus on self-growth rather than rushing into a new relationship speaks volumes about his maturity and resilience. This chapter is a testament to the power of solitude and the importance of self-reflection. Chapter 9. A new beginning. One day, months after the divorce was finalized, I bumped into an old friend. We talked, laughed, and for the first time, I felt a spark that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. It was a small thing, a simple reminder that there was a world outside of my pain. She didn't know about my divorce, didn't know the weight I'd been carrying. And in a way, that was refreshing. I didn't have to explain myself or revisit old wounds. We exchanged numbers, and over time, a friendship blossomed. It was a gentle, unhurried kind of connection, one that felt natural, free from any expectations. I wasn't sure where it would go, but for the first time, I was open to the idea of something new. The past was beginning to lose its grip on me, and the future didn't feel as daunting as it once had. Author's comment. It's heartwarming to see Jack open himself up to new possibilities. He's been through so much, but he's allowing himself to feel again, to connect with someone without the weight of the past. This chapter feels like a breath of fresh air, a promise of healing and hope. Chapter 10. Letting go of the past. I had a choice. Carry the bitterness with me, or let it go. In time, I chose to let it go. I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about absolving Kayla or forgetting what she had done. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment that kept me tied to a past I no longer wanted. I learned to forgive, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved peace. And with that choice, I felt lighter. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, it all began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Author's comment. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things to achieve, especially after such deep betrayal. Jack's choice to forgive is a powerful one, a sign that he's truly moving on. It's inspiring to see him embrace peace, to let go of the burden he's carried for so long. Chapter 11. A life reclaimed. One afternoon, several months after the divorce, I stopped by a local coffee shop, needing a break from work. I had just settled into a quiet corner with my coffee, reading the paper, when I heard a familiar voice. Looking up, I saw Rachel, an old friend from college. I hadn't seen her in years. She'd moved away, and our lives had taken us in different directions. But there she was, standing in line, smiling in that way I remembered from years ago. She spotted me and her eyes widened in surprise. "Jack, is that you?" she asked, walking over with a laugh. I stood, smiling back, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Rachel, it's been, what, 10 years? Closer to 15, I think," she said, shaking her head, her voice carrying the same lightness I remembered from all those years ago. We got our coffee and found a table, settling in as if no time had passed at all. We spent the next hour catching up, sharing stories of the intervening years. She filled me in on her career, her travels, her life in a new city, and for once, I didn't feel the need to explain my own story. I didn't tell her about the divorce, didn't talk about the betrayal, didn't carry the weight of my past into the conversation. And in a strange way, it felt refreshing, even freeing. As we talked and laughed, I felt something in me shift, a spark that had nothing to do with the bitterness, anger, or sadness I'd carried for so long. It was a lightness I'd almost forgotten. She didn't know the pain I'd gone through, the broken trust, the long nights spent piecing myself back together. And because of that, I wasn't reminded of it. I didn't feel like the guy who'd been cheated on, or the man who'd lost everything. With Rachel, I was just me, just Jack. Before we parted, she handed me her phone. "Here," she said, grinning. "We're not waiting another 15 years to catch up. Put your number in." I chuckled, typing my number into her phone. "You're right. I'm terrible at staying in touch, but I'll make an exception this time." We said goodbye with a hug, and as I watched her walk away, I realized something had shifted within me. For the first time, the future didn't seem like a shadowy, uncertain path. It felt open, a little lighter. I hadn't been looking for anything, hadn't felt ready for something new, but this meeting had opened a door, reminding me there was a world outside of my pain. Over the next few weeks, we texted back and forth, casual conversations. Author's comment. Jack's transformation is complete. He's found his strength, reclaimed his life, and is ready for a future free from the shadows of his past. This chapter is a celebration of resilience, a reminder that we all have the power to rebuild ourselves. Chapter 12. The road ahead. Looking back, I don't regret the life I shared with Kayla. It taught me lessons I never would have learned otherwise. But now, my life is my own again, filled with promise and hope. I am ready to move forward, not because I need to escape the past, but because I have finally found peace within myself. The future is unknown, but for the first time, that doesn't scare me. I am stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever comes my way. Author's comment. This final chapter is a beautiful conclusion to Jack's journey.